There's been a wave of mini consoles in the past few years from Nintendo, Sega, and PlayStation, all appealing greatly to the sense of nostalgia that comes with seeing a tiny version of these machines and getting your hands on those classic controllers again. For me, the TurboGrafx-16 Mini is something else entirely. It's this vein of gaming I never tapped into, a whole dimension of new games I didn't get to play when they were new. Growing up, I only had one friend who ever had a TurboGrafx-16, so aside from vague memories of Keith, Courage, and Bonk, I really didn't know much about any of these games until they started to release on the Wii Virtual Console. Even then, there were only a handful I ever played. Now Konami has given me a chance to dive into a library of 57 classic games from the 80s and 90s, most of which I've never touched before. Instead of fond memories, my time at the Mini has been fueled entirely out of curiosity, and over the past week, I've tried every one of these games, most for 10 to 15 minutes, but some for an hour or more, just depending on how well they grab me. Well, the system launched late and never got much traction in the US. One thing this past week has taught me is just how ahead of its time the PC Engine was in Japan. At a time when I was still playing the Commodore 64 and NES, Hudson was starting to release games on CDs with bombastic anime-style introductions, voice acting, and high-quality music.
Are you here to rescue me? How wonderful it would be to escape these chains.
There were well over a dozen versions of the machine, as well as constant advances in technology that are wonderfully illustrated by going through this game lineup, as the TurboGrafx-16 Mini includes not just US releases, but a catalog of Japanese titles as well. Before we get into the games though, I want to talk about the hardware itself. As if it were repeating history, the TurboGrafx-16 Mini is destined to have a pretty limited release. It costs $100, it's exclusive to Amazon, and shipping complications due to the coronavirus have resulted in no one being exactly sure when this thing will reach the hands of customers. Amazon has a placeholder date of December 31st, but Konami sent out review units a few weeks ago, and the publisher is indicating that orders may be shipping as early as this week. It's also worth noting that there are 3 different form factors for the hardware. Japan is getting one based on the PC Engine, Europe is getting a box based on the PC Engine core graphics, and we're of course getting the TurboGrafx-16. Taking the system out of the box, the first thing I notice is that the TurboGrafx-16 Mini is not so mini. By looking at a few images of the original online, it does look like this version is a little smaller, but not in such a way as to make it a novelty. Otherwise, it's replicated to an intricate level of detail, even including the now pointless port cover on the back of the console, making it a bit of a pain to route your cables through if you decide to leave it attached. Like some of the other mini consoles, it's powered via USB instead of a standard wall plug, although you can get a plug separately. As for the controller, Konami has learned from its competitors' mistakes, and they've included a lengthy 10-foot cord. One downside is that only one controller comes in the box, and additional controllers from Hori only match the PC Engine's design. For 5-player games, you'd also need the multi-tap, and adding it all up, you'd be putting down an extra $130, basically just to play Bomberman. One of the curiosities of the TurboGrafx specifically is the controller also has turbo sliders by default, so any game shipped on the platform could be designed to take advantage of them. In practice, it doesn't appear that it was used too much, but Bonk does implement turbo really well. Repeated headbutting while airborne causes Bonk to spin, slowing his descent, and with turbo enabled, he spins fast enough to basically hover, which is essential for collecting fruit in some minigames. For the sake of simplifying the international release and providing a complete look at the platform's heritage, each version of the system has a nearly identical set of games with separate menus for US and Japanese titles. The system outputs at 720p with several display options which are curiously unlabeled, but one of them does appear to be a square pixel option for you weirdos, while another stretches the image to 16:9 if you want to burn out your eyes. The most intriguing option attempts to emulate the portable Turbo Express, but even if you had one of these, it's hard to imagine playing this way for long. There is a toggle to turn CRT scan lines on and off, but it's a tough choice as neither option seems to be a perfect fit. Without scan lines, the image just seems too sharp and flat at times, as if you've taken a painting off of its canvas. However, turning them on can make the colors feel somewhat dim. While it may not be the best filter, I ultimately prefer keeping it on for the most part. Additionally, while the Mini doesn't have any form of rewind, it does include 4 save state slots per game, which is greatly appreciated for the unforgiving difficulty of many of these titles. The overall game lineup includes 25 English titles on the TurboGrafx-16 side, and 32 Japanese games on the PC Engine side. Which games are included where can feel a bit puzzling at first. Bonk's Adventure is only in Japanese, while Bonk's Revenge is only in English, but the 5 games that are available in both languages are all heavily text-based, so it makes sense to have those options for players. On a similar note, there are 4 Japanese games that you really can't expect to make much progress in without a strong understanding of the language or at least an exhaustive guide. This includes Snatcher, Hideo Kojima's celebrated cyberpunk adventure, which from the opening movie clearly draws inspiration from both Blade Runner and Terminator. Since Snatcher is primarily focused on text-based navigation, I sadly wasn't able to get very far. For the other 48 games that are left, I'll try to talk about these in distinct groups, working up to the best of the bunch. 4 of these games are absolute stinkers. Moto Rotor might be one of the worst racing games I've ever played, awkwardly pulling cars from the back of the pack and putting them in front of you so no one falls off screen. JJ and Jeff is one of those games that puts humor above gameplay, and it just feels obnoxious as a result. This platformer portrays rival coworkers and pooping birds, while trying to pull practical jokes on the player, hiding objectives, and reveling in poor controls. It just results in frustration. The Kungfu is the earliest of the bunch, but it feels like it was made just to show off how large they could make the sprites, as the action really doesn't hold up. You walk automatically, punching and kicking enemies as they come on screen, and I stopped after facing off with the same boss for the 2nd time in a row. Meanwhile, another Japanese title, the Genji and the Heike clans, feels like 3 unrelated prototypes duct taped together, and each gameplay style feels stiff, annoying, and unpolished. Okay, let's talk about ports. There are a lot of games on the TurboGrafx-16 Mini that are either variations of things you've probably already played, or sequels that don't go too far from what you'd expect. On the low end of this are games like Galaga 88, Space Harrier, and Fantasy Zone, which just don't seem all that different. And Ninja Gaiden, which somehow feels like it's lost the character of the NES game, while being equally as annoying. That said, there are cool games like Splatterhouse and a lot of fascinating versions of games that I didn't know existed. Ghosts and Goblins is hidden away under its Japanese name Daima Kaimura. Meanwhile, New Adventure Island picks up from the NES games I played as a kid when we thought the series was cool just because it let you ride a skateboard. The most appealing of this bunch for me is a trilogy of Gradius games. The NES version of Gradius is a shoot 'em up I've always come back to despite never getting good at it, and the PC Engine version is like seeing the game with fresh eyes. On top of that is Salamander, known as Life Force in the US, which I knew about but never got to play. The PC Engine version clearly has some advancements going on as well, with lots of huge moving elements, organic sections that regrow after you shoot them, etc. And third is Gradius 2, which was exclusive to PC Engine. It's brutally hard, with a voice clip that taunts you to get more practice when you die, but it has more options. And after beating my head against the wall with a default setup, I chose ripple lasers and finally took that Phoenix out. On that note, if you haven't noticed already, there are a lot of shoot 'em ups on this machine. I counted them all, and there are 21 games that comfortably fit into the category. That's a lot for one genre, and playing everything back to back was admittedly tiresome at times, since so many of the weapons and upgrade systems are similar between games. However, you shouldn't just write off this whole group either, as many of these games do stand apart, and it seems like there's a bit of an arms race for them to differentiate themselves. Games like Soldier Blade and Spriggan have impressive anime-style openings with voice acting and attempts at lip-sync. Spriggan Mark II puts even more emphasis on voice work, with dialogue that pops up in the midst of gameplay. Lords of Thunder features epic wailing guitars and its CD-empowered soundtrack. Dragon Spirit has you controlling a dragon instead of a spaceship, with power-ups that multiply your number of heads, as well as distinct attacks to focus on either ground forces or aerial assaults. Irzonk combines your character with a dog to blast enemies with the word bow. The ever-strange Choaniki has you navigating bodybuilders through space in what feels like a circus of unending sideshows as one bizarre act is followed by the next. And the similarly lighthearted Star Parodier has perhaps the most amazing opening of the bunch, in which a giant Bomberman and giant PC Engine are built to join the fight. Once you fly the PC Engine, one of the power-ups even allows you to blast enemies with CDs. Shmups may have faded into the background today, but the TurboGrafx-16 Mini lets you experience so many that were in their prime. I'll stop short of giving a verdict on every single thing that's included on this system. This last batch of games I want to focus on are all titles that I found interesting, unique, or just plain fun. Alien Crush is a really cool pinball game that's clearly drawn inspiration from the Alien films. Unofficially, of course. The fleshy environments shine as the ball smashes into monstrous jaws, and by knocking it down their throats, you can open passages to several different minigames. Military Madness is like Advance Wars on the Moon. You direct units across a hex-based map, have to account for terrain advantages, and can win by either destroying enemy units or capturing bases. While so many older strategy games feel tough to get into, Military Madness is instantly accessible. Nutopia and Utopia 2 are essentially clones of the original Zelda game, with the towns of Dragon Quest and more linear progression overall. I recently played almost the entirety of the Virtual Console version of Nutopia 2 and loved it. The original Nutopia doesn't seem drastically different, but it honestly would be much harder to get through as the low health alert is absolutely grating to the ears. The Legend of Valkyrie is a very different looking adventure that has a lot more platforming as well as some elements of shoot-'em-ups that seem to bleed into its combat. Past branch as you progress, but you can't go backwards, making for interesting decisions each time you come across a fork in the road. At one point I found a hidden cave, and a character gave me a spell that made me huge, killing enemies every time I jumped. Very cool. It is a letdown that I couldn't play Bomberman 94's multiplayer, but the single player mode is a big step up from Bomberman 93, which is also included on the Mini. Levels in 93 just feel like variations of the same classic grid. However, in 94 they branch way out and feel more like an adventure. Levels have different shapes, obstacles, and objectives. Sometimes there are bridges or caves to venture through, and from time to time you get to ride a kangaroo. How can you say no to that? True Man Foo is a game I expected to bounce off pretty quickly, but it managed to get its hooks in me. It's a puzzle game that has you rolling colored balls onto matching switches. Doesn't look or sound like much, but as I got into ever more complex mazes, new elements kept me on my toes. You can kick the balls into walls to smash them apart and make shorter routes. You can choose to kill enemies, but due to quick respawns, it's actually better to trap them. Some enemies freeze the balls in place, items make hidden switches appear, and if you fail, you can retry without too much effort. Of course, one of the most recognized PC Engine games is Castlevania Rondo of Blood, which didn't come to the US in its original form for many years. Nowadays, there are a few ways to play it, but that doesn't stop it from being a highlight of this collection. The dramatic opening with German voice acting, the beautiful and grotesque creature designs, the move toward telling more of a story, and the outstanding music all make this one of the more memorable Castlevania games. And it's also one of the last before the series changed direction toward Metroidvania with Symphony of the Night.
Ys, the ideal utopia. Once a country so peaceful and prosperous. A country where children were as free as the wind.
The game that impressed me the most comes from a long-running series that I've heard about for decades, but I've never gotten my hands on. However, once I started Ys Book 1 and 2, I didn't want to put it down. It's one of the earliest CD-based RPGs ever made. It starts with a really incredible opening, it has a high-quality soundtrack from Yuzo Koshiro, there are snippets of voice acting here and there throughout, and portraits for shopkeepers and other NPCs are gorgeously illustrated. For a game that was released in 1990, it feels like an alternate universe. This is the same year that Final Fantasy came out in the US. Combat is certainly a little odd as you sort of bump into enemies to attack, but after learning how it works, it's not too hard to adapt and get into the usual RPG goodness of grinding for cash, upgrading gear, and taking on more difficult foes. Ys is the game I put the most time into, and I'd love to go back and play more. As someone new to this library, it's a little hard to definitively comment on what's missing, but after looking through some lists of favorites, it feels like some of the most notable absences are Devil's Crush, the sequel to Alien Crush, Legendary Axe, Ys 3, and Keith's Courage, which feels like it should have been included regardless of quality, just because it was the original pack-in game for the TurboGrafx-16. While most of the lineup for the TurboGrafx-16 and PC Engine may not hold up to the same legacy of the Super NES, Genesis, or PlayStation, there's a lot here to love and a lot of attention to detail. Near the end of my time playing, I came across a strange and happy accident. You see, one of the little bonuses of this package is an animation that shows you inserting the game into the system, whether it's card-based or CD-based. And there's even a great high-pitched sound effect for the disc starting to spin. Over the PC Engine's life, there are actually several different formats for CDs, essentially requiring different firmware cards to read them. And one of the times that I booted a game, I got an error message that the wrong card had been inserted. After tweeting about my discovery, someone let me know that I could force the system to insert the wrong card by holding the select button in order to see the different error messages for each individual game. The best of the bunch turned out to be Castlevania, as it actually loads a playable, low-quality version of the game, as if to make fun of you for inserting the wrong card. It's details like this that you really won't find on a standard game collection. There's a real sense that the TurboGrafx-16 Mini wasn't just thrown together to cash in on a quick trend, but that the developers have gone to great lengths to recreate what it was like to play these forward-thinking consoles when they were originally released.